In a quaint suburban neighborhood, the Parker family was known for their close-knit bond and joyful gatherings. They often spent their evenings sharing stories, laughter, and delicious home-cooked meals. This particular night was no different. The atmosphere was filled with warmth and camaraderie as they enjoyed their dinner together. As the evening of lighthearted conversation and joy drew to a close, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Lori, the enthusiastic 12-year-old, leaped up from her seat, punching her father and brother to the door. She quickly returned to the dining area, her expression marked by confusion. "A police officer is here, Dad. He wants to have a word with you," she announced. Frank felt a surge of anxiety, but managed to keep his composure for the sake of his children. He approached the door and was greeted by a Georgia State Trooper. "Are you Frank Parker?" inquired the officer. "Yes, that's me," Frank replied. "And are you Meredith Parker's spouse?" With a nod from Frank, the trooper glanced at the children and requested, "Could we talk in private, Mr. Parker?" Frank felt his throat tighten and cleared it before speaking. "Bobby, Lori, go to your rooms. I need to talk to the officer alone." The children started to protest, but when their father snapped, "Now!" they quickly obeyed. They weren't used to hearing such a tone. Once they left, the officer turned to Frank. "Mr. Parker, I have bad news. Your wife's plane is missing and presumed shot down. It vanished from radar tonight halfway between Miami International Airport and Nassau. A Coast Guard ship is searching for survivors." The situation was clear. Meredith, the VP of regional sales for a large multinational company, was traveling with the region's CFO to the company's Caribbean headquarters. An experienced pilot, Meredith's 180-mile flight to Nassau should have been routine. Frank hadn't worried when she called to inform him of her plans. Now he was distraught, facing his worst nightmare. His wife's plane had crashed in shark-infested Caribbean waters. The officer gave a few more details, none of which reassured Frank, and promised the Coast Guard would call in the morning or sooner with any news. As soon as the officer left, Bobby and Lori rushed to Frank, their faces full of concern, asking questions he couldn't answer. He knew they'd been eavesdropping. They huddled together, trying to console one another. Lori started crying, and Bobby's eyes reddened. Frank tried to stay composed for his children, but inside he was furious. They couldn't focus on dishes or homework and spent the evening clinging to each other. Though it was past their bedtime, they waited for a call that never came. Finally, exhausted and scared, the three of them fell asleep together in Frank's bed for the first time since the kids were little. The next morning, while attempting to eat breakfast, a Coast Guard representative called. Any hope was quickly dashed when they reported no findings. Frank called the children's school principal to explain their absence, then found Bobby and Lori watching CNN's coverage of the missing plane. Unsure if he should let them watch, the phone rang again, starting a cascade of calls. Meredith's parents and his own were the first, all trying to sound optimistic despite their worry. Frank promised to update them with any news. Calls from Meredith's friends and coworkers followed, each wanting to help but unsure how. The conversations were brief and awkward. The hardest calls were from the media. Caught off guard, Frank talked longer than he wanted with a reporter from the Journal-Constitution. Realizing the pattern, he started screening calls, answering only those from loved ones. Neighbors and friends began arriving with condolences and food. Initially, Frank appreciated the meals, lacking energy to cook, but soon they had more than they could eat. Each dish, a Southern tradition to show concern, became a painful reminder of his likely loss. The next few days were horrible. The Parkers, practically prisoners in their home, avoided people and clung to the hope of news from the Coast Guard. Frank called the Miami office daily, but the reports were always negative. 5 days later, a Coast Guard officer called with the dreaded news. Wreckage of Meredith's plane was found with no sign of survivors. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer concluded, "but we have to stop search and rescue efforts." Frank wanted to hide and mourn alone, but there was no chance for that. He faced an overwhelming list of responsibilities, starting with breaking the sad news to Bobby and Lori and comforting them. Once they calmed down, he had to call family and friends, arrange a memorial service, and write an obituary. By the end, Frank was exhausted. The family endured the service and began the slow process of returning to normal life. The children went back to school, which helped a bit, but Frank struggled with new responsibilities. On a friend's advice, he contacted a lawyer about legal matters and was shocked to learn he needed a pass-away certificate. "But her plane crashed at sea," Frank protested. "I know," the lawyer said, "but without a body, the court must issue an official statement. Do I really have to wait 7 years?" "No," the lawyer assured him. "Cases like this usually resolve quickly. I'll draft a petition and help you amend other documents like bank accounts, mortgages, and insurance. Frank, overwhelmed, knew he also had to contact his wife's company about benefits. He dreaded calling the widow of John Collier, the CFO, on the plane with Meredith. Though Frank disliked Collier, he felt it was his duty. When he called, Amanda Collier was already waiting. As they exchanged condolences, Frank realized she understood his grief. She asked, "How are you, Frank?" "It's hard, Amanda. I can't accept she's gone. Everything reminds me of her. I keep thinking I see her in crowds." He looked at the floor, overcome with emotion. Amanda knew no words would help. "And you, Amanda? How are you?" "It's not easy, but I'm managing," she said. "John and I didn't have kids, so it's different for me. We didn't get along before this. If he hadn't died, we were headed for divorce." "I'm sorry to hear that," Frank said sympathetically. "One moment I'm relieved I don't have to deal with his affairs, and the next, I feel guilty for not being sadder. But some part of me still misses him." "Will you be okay financially?" Frank asked. "I'll manage. The company insured John's life, so I'll get twice the face value. But he made bad investments, and we lost a lot of money." Frank wasn't surprised by John Collier's behavior. Amanda's mention of company-paid life insurance reminded him to contact Meredith's benefits department. After chatting a bit longer, Frank rose to leave. "Amanda, I'm sorry, but I have to leave. Bobby and Lori will be out of school soon, and I need to pick them up. Please keep in touch, and if you need anything, even just to talk, call me." When Frank arrived home with Bobby and Lori, he was surprised to see a car parked outside. Leading the children through the garage, the doorbell rang. Outside stood a man in his 50s and a young woman in business attire. "I'm Special Agent Harold Barnes, and this is Special Agent Celia Murray. We're with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. We'd like to ask you some questions about your wife's disappearance." Lori clung to her father's waist, tears soaking his shirt. "What does that mean?" Frank demanded angrily. Agent Murray intervened. "I'm sorry we upset your daughter, Mr. Parker. We're just doing a routine check related to your application for Mrs. Parker's pass-away certificate. We can come back later if you prefer." Frank reassured his daughter. "It's okay, sweetheart. Nothing bad happened." Agent Murray knelt and offered Lori a napkin, which she hesitantly took to wipe her eyes. Frank then sent Lori to her room to do her homework. Turning to the agents, Frank said, "If it won't take long, let's get it over with." They moved to the living room and sat around the coffee table. "We need some information about your wife," Agent Barnes began. "How long were you married?" "Since 1990, right after we graduated from the University of Georgia," Frank replied, recalling the beautiful brunette he had married. "And she worked for the International Marketing Corporation until she disappeared." "Yes, she was the VP of sales for the southeastern U.S. Why would she go to the Bahamas?" Agent Murray asked. "The southeast region included Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. Their Caribbean headquarters was in Nassau, so Mary often flew there." "Mary?" the woman inquired. "Mary was my pet name for her," Frank said hoarsely. Agent Murray patted him on the shoulder. "It's okay, Mr. Parker. I know this is hard." Agent Barnes changed the subject. "Did your wife normally fly her own plane for business trips?" "Yes, her father was a pilot, and she got her license young. She preferred flying herself to stay independent of commercial airline schedules." "What about you, Mr. Parker? What do you do?" "I'm a house husband," Frank smiled. "I was an aerospace engineer until 3 years ago when my company downsized. Moving for a new job wasn't an option, but Mary's career was thriving, so we decided I'd handle the household and kids." "And how did this change affect your relationship?" Agent Barnes asked. "What's that got to do with it?" Frank snapped. Agent Murray interjected. "We need to see if any factors played a role in your wife's disappearance. This is routine." Frank calmed down. "It was a big change, but as an engineer, I evaluated all factors. It made sense for our family. Mary focused on her career, and I took care of Bobby and Lori." The agents were silent, and Frank continued. "It wasn't easy. She was often busy with clients and meetings, and I felt her work came first. But that's common in corporate life, and things were going well." "Two more questions, Mr. Parker," Agent Barnes said. "Did you notice any changes in your wife's behavior before she disappeared?" "Not really," Frank replied after a moment. "She was under a lot of pressure and traveling more, but Mary said she was in line for a promotion that would reduce her travel and come with a higher position and pay." "One last question," Agent Barnes said, taking notes. "Are you aware of any recent changes in your finances?" "No," Frank answered confidently. "I manage our finances and haven't noticed anything unusual." Agent Murray handed Frank her card. Thank you, Mr. Parker. If you think of anything else, please call me. The agents left, and Frank checked on his children who were busy with homework. They're strong kids, he thought. They've been through a lot and are holding up well. The next day, Frank visited IMC headquarters to discuss Meredith's benefits. The head of the department expressed condolences and handed him a box of Meredith's belongings, including a family portrait. A specialist reviewed Meredith's 401k account with Frank, revealing it was much higher than expected due to increased contributions. The specialist advised him to transfer the funds to his own IRA for easier management. Frank also learned about the substantial insurance benefit Meredith had chosen, which would provide her income for almost 4 years. The insurance company will pay annually to minimize taxes, the specialist explained, contingent on receiving Meredith's pass-away certificate. After meeting with the GBI agents, Frank was confident it would arrive soon. Relieved, he realized he wouldn't need to find a job immediately. "Thank you, Mary," he whispered. A few days later, as Frank prepared dinner, the doorbell rang. Special Agent Murray stood there and informed him the investigation was complete and the pass-away certificate issued. Frank sighed in relief. Suddenly, Lori's panicked cry came from the back of the house. "Daddy, help me!" Frank rushed to her room with Agent Murray following. Lori was staring at a large red stain on her jeans. "I'm bleeding, Daddy!" she cried. "What happened, Lori?" Frank asked, horrified. Agent Murray stepped in. "Let me handle this," she said firmly, pushing Frank toward the door. "Wait in the living room." After 15 anxious minutes, Celia emerged. "Lori's fine. You need to go to the store and buy sanitary napkins. Get the smallest size." "But Lori, Bobby," Frank started to protest. "I'll take care of Lori and explain to Bobby. You go to the store and hurry back," she insisted. On the way, Frank realized Lori was menstruating. He berated himself for not having talked to her about growing up. "Oh, Mary, I need you more than ever," Frank thought. When he got home, Celia met him at the door and took the package. "You did good, Daddy," she said, smiling. She went into Lori's room. After 30 minutes, Celia reappeared, hugging Lori. Frank knelt and hugged his daughter. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I should have talked to you about this earlier." "It's all right, Daddy," Lori said. "I just got scared. Celia explained it all to me. Now I know what to do." She held Celia's hand, and Frank realized his daughter had made a new friend. He turned to Celia. "Thank you. It's good you were here. I'm not great with girls." Celia smiled, but Bobby interrupted. "Does this mean we won't have dinner tonight? I'm starving." Lori shrieked, but Frank held her back. "Bobby, if you talk to your sister like that again, you'll go to bed hungry," Frank warned. "Now go wash your hands and set the table." He turned to Celia. "Please join us for dinner." Celia hesitated, but Lori tugged her arm. "Please, Celia, stay." Celia smiled and agreed. At dinner, the kids bombarded Celia with questions about law enforcement. Frank was amused and relieved to see his children coming out of their sorrow. After dinner, Frank offered Celia coffee. "You seem comfortable with kids. Do you work with them often?" he asked. "I come from a big family, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. I was the oldest, so I was like a second mom," Celia explained. "That's why I knew what to do with Lori. I helped my sisters through puberty." Frank grinned. "I'm glad you were here. I wouldn't have known how to calm Lori." Celia's expression turned serious. "How are they coping with their mother's loss?" Frank sighed. "Lori is very clingy and Bobby is moody and withdrawn. I don't know if it's because of Mary's pass away or his teenage years." Celia looked at him sympathetically. "You're doing a great job. It will take time for all of you." She stood up. "I've intruded long enough. I'd like to say goodbye to Lori and Bobby." She hugged Lori, who walked with her arm around Celia's waist. She really has a new friend, Frank thought. A few days later, a package arrived for Lori, a pink stuffed elephant and a note from Celia. Frank was puzzled by the choice, but was surprised to see it take a prominent place on Lori's bed. "I guess she still has a little girl in her," he admitted. He called Celia to thank her. Celia was pleased and asked Frank to keep in touch. Weeks later, Bobby's teacher called to discuss discipline problems. Frank scheduled a meeting for the next day, but decided not to tell Bobby until he knew more. Mrs. Soldana, the home grade teacher, told Frank that Bobby's behavior had worsened over the past few months. "At first, I didn't want to say anything because I know he's been through a lot," the teacher explained. "But it seems to be getting worse. He's distracted, not doing homework, and not paying attention in class. If this continues, his grades will drop significantly." Frank was concerned. "How much of this is just being a teenager?" he asked. "It's a difficult age, especially for boys," she replied. "But I think his mother's pass away is affecting him more than he admits. You might want to see a psychologist." Frank thanked her and waited anxiously for the kids to finish gym class. Determined to talk to Bobby, he sent Lori to her room for homework and took Bobby to the master bedroom. Seeing his father's serious expression, Bobby knew he was in trouble. Frank recounted the teacher's concerns. "What's going on, Bobby? Why are you acting like this?" Frank demanded. "Just because," Bobby muttered. "Don't you care about your grades?" Frank pressed. "Not really," Bobby replied sullenly. Annoyed by his son's unresponsiveness, Frank tried to shame him. "What would your mother think?" "Who cares? She was a strumpet," Bobby shouted angrily. Shocked, Frank grabbed his son. "Don't talk about your mother like that. How can you say that?" Bobby whispered. "I saw her with another man." Bobby collapsed onto the bed, sobbing. Frank sat next to him, holding him. "It's okay," he repeated, trying to calm him. When Bobby's crying subsided, Frank asked gently, "Tell me what you saw." "It was last fall. I forgot my homework and sneaked home. I heard my mom come in and hid. I heard a man's voice. They went to your room, and when I looked in, they were on the bed." Bobby's words tumbled out, and he burst into tears again. "Why did she do that, Daddy? How could she be such a strumpet?" Frank felt numb but focused on comforting Bobby. "Sometimes people make mistakes. It doesn't mean we don't love them. Your mother loved you and Lori very much. Remember the good things about her." Frank talked to Bobby until he calmed down, then sent him to do homework. He asked Bobby not to tell Lori, and Bobby promised. The rest of the evening passed quietly. After the kids went to bed, Frank grappled with his emotions. At first, he wanted to deny what Bobby had seen, but he knew his son was too upset to have misunderstood. Frank felt betrayed. How could Mary have cheated on him? Who was the man? How long had it been going on? Losing her in a plane crash was hard, but realizing he lost her long before was devastating. He couldn't sleep that night. The next day, Frank went to the gym, hoping exercise would distract him. But while on the treadmill, his thoughts returned to Mary's infidelity. How could she do that in our bed? It must have been one of those days when I went to the gym, he realized. His habitual routine had made it easy for her to plan. If she planned her meetings around my schedule, it wasn't sudden. How often did she meet him? Her travel could have interfered. Each question led to more misery. Frank tried to act normal around Bobby and Lori, but he was suffering. He went to the pharmacy for antacids, having never had stomach problems before. He had no one to talk to about his discovery. Telling his parents or Meredith's family would devastate them, and he didn't want neighborhood gossip or classmates teasing his kids. He felt trapped. One evening, he saw Celia Murray's business card. Desperate to share his news, he called her. Celia was pleased to hear from him, but concerned when he said he needed to talk. "Are Lori and Bobby okay?" she asked. "They're fine, but I'm not. Can we have lunch tomorrow?" She agreed and suggested a quiet place near her office. Frank felt relieved. Celia was waiting at the restaurant. Seeing his distressed face, she asked, "For heaven's sake, Frank, what's wrong?" "You asked for more information about my wife," he began. "I found out Meredith was cheating on me." Tears filled his eyes. Celia reached for his hands. "Oh, Frank, that's terrible. Tell me everything." He recounted the teacher meeting, confronting Bobby and Bobby's revelation. Celia listened silently. "Poor Bobby," she said. "No wonder he's struggling at school. And with her pass away, he's even more troubled." She squeezed Frank's hands. "I can't imagine what you're going through. Did you see any signs?" "No," he replied. "The husband is always the last to know. Our Zek's life declined after her promotion, but I thought it was due to her job pressure. She said things would get better, but that didn't happen." He frowned. "I have no answers. Who was he? How long did it last? Did she plan to leave me? Why did she do this to us?" Celia squeezed his hands again. "Frank, you may never get answers. With her gone, it doesn't matter anymore. Focus on your family and yourself." "I know you're right, but it hurts. I think when she stopped loving me—" "No," Celia said firmly. "Meredith cared deeply about you and the kids. She got maximum life insurance and maxed out her 401k to ensure your future. She cared." "Thank you, Celia. I'll try to remember that." As they stood to leave, he noticed neither had touched their food. "I guess I'm not good lunch company." "Don't worry," she replied. "Skipping a meal or two is probably good for me." He looked at her and thought, "She looks good to me. Stay in touch, Frank, and let me know if I can help." She kissed his cheek, and as she turned away, Frank thought he saw her blush. Back at home, Frank felt surprisingly lighter. I guess I really needed to talk it out, he thought. The following Saturday, while cleaning up storm debris in the yard, Frank noticed Lori on the phone. He asked Bobby, "Did someone call?" "No," Bobby replied. "She's talking to her new best friend, Celia." "Does she call Celia a lot, and what's a BFF?" "Oh, Dad," Bobby sighed. "BFF means best friend forever." Lori looked up and asked, "Daddy, can we take Celia to dinner?" "Let me talk to her," Frank said, taking the phone. "Hi, Celia. Would you like to have dinner with us tonight?" She quickly agreed. "Great. See you around 6 o'clock, Frank said, turning to Lori. "She's coming. Let's clean up so she doesn't think we live like pigs." "Oh, Dad, do I have to?" Bobby complained, but started tidying up. Frank decided to make a special fish dish, which meant a trip to the grocery store. He found a nice piece of salmon, picked up dessert, a bottle of wine, and a bouquet of flowers. "I guess I'm going all out," he thought. Celia arrived at 6 o'clock, and Lori welcomed her in. Even Bobby made polite conversation. Frank felt a bit awkward, but Celia didn't seem to notice. She chatted with Lori and explored her room while Frank finished dinner. The meal was a success, and Celia teased, "Oh, a man who can cook. Mother warned me about you." After dinner, Celia helped with the cleanup. With the kids occupied, Frank and Celia filled their wine glasses and moved to the living room. "Frank, dinner was wonderful. Thank you for inviting me." "Lori wouldn't forgive me if I hadn't," Frank laughed. "She's a wonderful girl, and you're doing a great job," Celia said. Then her tone changed. "Frank, I have some confidential information to share. You know the GBI conducted a routine investigation before issuing your wife's pass-away certificate. We found nothing unusual. But with John Collier, we discovered some oddities. He was in financial trouble due to bad investments." Frank nodded, recalling what Amanda Collier had told him. IMC Security found significant irregularities in the Southeastern Accounting Department, headed by John Collier. They uncovered a fraudulent billing scheme that may have embezzled millions from IMC, and John Collier appears to have authorized it. "Poor Amanda," Frank commented. "She didn't deserve that." But Celia's revelations sparked new thoughts. Could Collier have caused the crash to cover his tracks? What if Meredith found out? Could he be hiding somewhere? Frank speculated. "Frank, you're getting carried away," Celia cautioned. "The most likely scenario is still the plane going down unexpectedly. We'll explore all possibilities, but don't jump to conclusions." "Do you think Meredith was involved?" Frank asked. "It's unlikely," Celia replied. "She had no signs of planning to abandon her family, unlike Collier, whose marriage was falling apart. Meredith's finances were in perfect order. It's just speculation. The only fact we have is the plane crashed." "Frank, promise me you won't share this. It could jeopardize the investigation and my job," Celia warned. "I understand, and I promise. But why tell me?" Frank asked. "You might hear something that helps. Promise you'll tell me immediately. No Lone Rangers," she urged. "I promise," Frank replied. "Besides, I enjoy our talks." Celia smiled, lighting up the room. Celia said goodbye to Bobby and Lori. Frank noticed Bobby paused his game to say goodnight, a rare gesture. Lori walked Celia to the door, securing a promise to call. Celia kissed Frank on the cheek before leaving. "She likes you, Dad," Lori said. "I like her too," Frank replied, pulling Lori close. That night, Frank lay in bed thinking over what Celia had told him and imagining various scenarios. "Oh, Mary," he thought, "what have you gotten yourself into?" He eventually fell into a restless sleep. A week later, while browsing sports news on his computer, Frank noticed the Facebook icon. On a whim, he clicked it. Frank rarely used Facebook, except to monitor his children's activities. He insisted Bobby and Lori add him as a friend and give him their passwords, hoping to encourage them to be discreet. Logging in, Frank saw mostly uninteresting content, but noticed a friend request from Tom Thomason, a name he didn't recognize. There was no photo, just a silhouette. Clicking on the name, he found the stranger's information was only available to friends. "Hey, Bobby," Frank called out. "Do we know a Tom Thomason?" "No," Bobby replied. "He's been trying to friend me for weeks. I just delete his requests." Lori peeked in. "Yeah, he tried to friend me too. He's just some creep on Facebook." Frank was concerned. An unknown person wanted to contact not only him, but his children too. He reassured them, "You did the right thing. Never respond to strangers online." An idea struck him. "Maybe Celia can help us find out who this Thomason is." He called her, and she answered warmly. "Hi, Frank." "Hi, Celia. Can you come over? Something strange has come up and I need your help." "Bobby and Lori are fine, right?" she asked, concerned. "They're fine," he assured her. She promised to arrive in 45 minutes. Frank was impressed by her punctuality and neat appearance. "You look great, Celia. You didn't need to dress up for us," he said. "Thank you, Frank. I wanted to," she replied. Frank called the children over, and Bobby quickly logged into their Facebook accounts, showing the friend requests from Tom Thomason. Celia praised Bobby's skills and examined the messages, but found nothing useful. "It's probably a marketing ploy," she told them. "Never share your information with strangers, okay?" The children nodded solemnly, taking her advice seriously. As it got dark, Frank suggested they go out for dinner and invited Celia to join. The kids eagerly insisted, and she agreed. They went to a casual restaurant where Celia engaged the kids in conversation. Frank realized Celia probably knew more about their lives than Meredith had. The lively chat continued during dinner and the drive home, and Celia joined them inside. The kids asked Celia to watch TV with them, but she declined. "I need to talk to your daddy." She led Frank to the living room and turned serious. "I don't think those Facebook requests were a marketing ploy. The Bureau has alerts about identity theft scams, but they don't usually target kids. Someone might be trying to get your family's information." Frank felt a chill. "Who could it be? What do they want?" "I don't know. This doesn't fit any cyber fraud model I've seen," Celia said. "What can we do?" Frank asked. "Close their Facebook accounts. Maybe keep them off the internet." She thought for a moment. "If they're careful and don't communicate with strangers or click on suspicious links, they should be okay. But I have a friend in the federal government who might help. He might not find Tom Thomason, but could trace his location. I'll call on Monday and let you know." With those words, she got up and went to her room to say goodnight to the two children. When she returned, Frank walked her to the door. Before she opened it, he hugged her. "You've been like a guardian angel to us," he said sincerely. "I don't know what we would have done without you." She looked into his eyes for a moment, and then quickly kissed him on the lips. "I don't know if I want to be an angel," she said with a wink. "They don't have much fun." She then turned and walked quickly to her car, leaving Frank standing there bewildered. True to her word, Celia called Frank late Monday morning. "Do you know anyone in Palm Beach, Florida?" she asked. "Not a soul," Frank replied. "Whoever Tom Thomason is, he created his Facebook account with a zip code starting with 334, so he's somewhere in Palm Beach County," she said. "I can't imagine why someone in Palm Beach would try to contact us," Frank said. "But at least he's not nearby. That's reassuring." "I agree," Celia said. "Besides, we've been tracking a lot of scams in South Florida, so maybe this really is some new kind of internet scam. Just make sure Bobby and Lori have nothing to do with these friend requests." "I will, Celia, and thank you. I feel so much better about the whole thing." "I'm so glad I could help, Frank." Despite what he had told Celia, Frank was not reassured at all. On the contrary, he felt like he and his children were under constant attack. First came the terrible news of Meredith's pass away. Then, poor Bobby confessed that his wife had cheated on him. Then he got word that Mary might have been involved in some fraudulent business dealings before her pass away. And now some unknown person was trying to get information about his children. Frank felt like they were under siege, and he decided to fight back. His first priority was to find the enemy in Palm Beach County and confront him. But how could he do that? A quick internet search showed that the county had a population of 1.3 million. Looking for Tom Thomason would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. Besides, Frank thought the name could easily be fake. Frank's ordered mind continued to ponder the problem. Then an idea struck him. If I can't find Thomason, maybe I can get him to find me. A plan began to form in his mind. The chances are slim, he admitted, but it's all I've got. The first thing he needed to do was to get Bobby and Lori out of the way. It was almost time for summer vacation, and that gave Frank an idea. He dialed his in-laws' number. "Dad, would you and Mom like Bobby and Lori to come visit for a week? I'll need to go out of town during that time, so you'd be a big help." When the children's grandfather happily agreed and all the issues surrounding their stay were resolved, Frank hung up the phone and immediately called Delta. "I'd like to book a flight to Palm Beach." His children welcomed the news of their upcoming visit to their grandparents, but their enthusiasm waned when they learned that their father would not be traveling with them. It would be the first time they would be separated since their mother's pass away, and the prospect brought back the fear of abandonment they had felt since then. Frank hated to cause the children any distress, but he felt that he must do what he intended, and he succeeded in persuading them. A week before their visit began, Frank started having doubts. "Am I doing the right thing?" he asked himself. But despite the uncertainty, the thought of doing nothing was worse. His inner turmoil was briefly interrupted by a phone call from Celia, who called to inquire how he and his family were doing. After a few minutes of conversation, the tone of her voice changed slightly, and Frank thought she sounded almost shy. "I was wondering if you wanted to get together next week. I haven't seen you and the kids in a while," she said uncertainly. "I'd love to do that, Celia, but I'm taking the kids to their grandparents. We'll be gone all week." "Oh," she said, "I understand. Maybe some other time." "I'd like that very much, Celia," he said earnestly. Frank felt bad about lying to Celia about his plans, but he told himself at least it was partly true. Besides, he was sure he knew what she would say if he revealed his true plans. When Frank returned home and took the children to his relatives in the village, he immediately sat down at the family computer. One of the reasons he asked Meredith's family to take his children was that he knew they didn't have a computer, so he felt safe logging onto Lori's Facebook. Sure enough, a friend request came in from Tom Thomason. Frank clicked on the accept option and quickly received confirmation that Lori was now friends with this stranger. If nothing comes of this, Frank thought, I'll just unfriend him later. Next came the hardest part. Pretending to be a 12-year-old girl, he studied his daughter's previous messages and decided that he could imitate her style quite well. "I may not be able to fool her friends," he admitted to himself, "but I hope I can fool Tom Thomason." He decided that his first communication should lay the foundation and wrote a short note about her visit to the country. "Lori, just a little news for her friends," thought Frank. Nothing to arouse the suspicions of the lurkers. The next day he planned to set a trap. "OMG, I'm going to Florida. My best friend Celia offered to take me with her and my dad agreed. Flying out tomorrow, can't wait." Frank decided to call Celia by her first name, thinking that neither Lori's friends nor Tom Thomason knew her. He hoped Celia wouldn't mind. Now that the bait was set, Frank hoped he could attract the fish's attention. "I can't believe I'm in Palm Beach. That's amazing." That evening, Frank posted, "Spent the day at the beach. I'm going to be so tan." The next morning, he posted another note, hoping it would catch on. "I'm going back to the beach tonight. Tomorrow, Celia's taking me shopping on Worth Avenue. We'll have lunch at Taboo's Tukula." As soon as the post appeared on Lori's page, Frank headed to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Soon he was settled in his seat for the 2-hour flight to Palm Beach. Looking out the window, he remembered visiting Palm Beach once before. He and Mary had driven through town on their way back from their honeymoon in Miami Beach, crossing the Lake Worth Bridge and traveling down Southern Ocean Boulevard, admiring the mansions overlooking the Atlantic. After landing, Frank rented a car and drove to the motel in West Palm Beach where he had booked a room. There was a fast food restaurant across the street, so he grabbed a sandwich and a soda, which he ate in the room while studying a map of the city on his laptop. He hoped he was doing the right thing. After breakfast, he checked Lori's Facebook page but found only a few envious replies from her classmates. He didn't expect Thomason to contact him, but he hoped his fishing expedition might turn up something. Around 10 a.m., he got in his car and drove east over the Royal Park Bridge, turned south, and then east again to Worth Avenue. He wanted to be there early and needed to park on the street so he could get there quickly if necessary. After circling the block where the restaurant was several times, he began to wonder if he had miscalculated. Suddenly, a car pulled out in front of him, and he was able to pull into the parking space. Setting the meter, he walked down the street in front of the restaurant. Noticing a bench in the shade, he gratefully took a seat, put on his baseball cap and sunglasses, and pulled out a copy of the Palm Beach Post, pretending to read while scanning the street. As he sat there, he realized how flimsy his plan was. He had no idea if Tom Thomason had seen the fake posts on Lori's Facebook page or would show up in response. Worse, he had no idea who he was looking for. Unless the mystery man turned out to be John Collier, which Frank doubted, how would he recognize the threat? All he could do was hope to spot a suspicious man and come face to face with him. The street was crowded, and Frank tried to keep track of all the passers-by. The restaurant was starting to fill up, and his stomach rumbled as he watched people coming in. He cursed himself for not bringing a sandwich but didn't dare leave his post. Time stretched slowly, and after a while, he saw the crowd in the restaurant begin to thin. Glancing at his watch, he realized it had been over an hour. What an idiot, he thought. I wouldn't be any worse off if I stayed home and could at least see Celia again. As he watched the shoppers passing by, a woman crossing the street caught his eye. Here I go again, Frank thought, seeing Mary in a crowd of strangers. In fact, the woman looked nothing like Meredith at all. Meredith had shoulder-length brunette hair, while this woman was a blonde with a short haircut and dressed differently from anything Meredith would wear. But there was something eerily familiar about her, and as he continued to watch, Frank realized it was her gait that had triggered his reaction. He impulsively got up and followed her. Glancing down the street, he saw the blonde had reached the corner and was trying to hail a cab. Risking his life, Frank ran across Worth Avenue and jumped into his car. Just as he pulled away from the curb, he saw the woman climb into the back seat of the cab, which raced down the avenue toward the Atlantic before reaching Southern Ocean Boulevard. The cab turned left onto County Road and headed north. Frank followed it for some distance. Finally, he saw the cab turn left onto a suburban street and continue until it almost reached Lake Worth. Frank stopped the car at the curb about a soccer field away and watched as the woman paid the driver and entered an elegant house facing the lake. Frank squinted, trying to get a good look at her. Despite her different hair color and cut, she was the same height and weight as Mary. And as she walked down the path toward the house, Frank was again struck by her gait. Sitting in the car, Frank suddenly remembered a book he had read long ago. In the story, an actor needed a disguise and put pebbles in his shoes to change his walk. "If someone sees me," the actor said, "they'll say, 'Looks like that guy, but it's not him because I'll walk differently.'" It works the other way too, thought Frank. Recalling the book, he became certain he had just seen his deceased wife. Holding back his growing anger, he ran down the street and walked to the door. He rang the doorbell and crossed his arms, waiting. The woman opened the door, looking perplexed. Then she did a double take and shrieked, "Frank, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Mary. Funny to meet you here," he said sarcastically. After a moment's hesitation, she spread her arms to hug him, but he quickly raised his hands to stop her. "Don't touch me," he growled. Then, unable to contain his anger any longer, he shouted, "How could you do this to me? How could you leave Bobby and Lori?" Meredith threw an anxious glance outside, grabbed his arm and dragged him into the house, slamming the door behind her. "I did it all for you, baby. For you and the kids," she urged. "You have to believe me. It was the only way out." "What the hell are you talking about?" demanded Frank hotly. "You're missing the point. None of this makes any sense." "Sit down, little one," she coaxed. "You have to let me explain everything." She was still speaking loudly and rubbed her hands together nervously, sitting down and urging him on. When Frank sat down, an icy calm descended upon him. "Okay, Mary. I'm listening. I was so close to it, baby. I had a coveted big job in my pocket, but then the damn economy tanked. I knew if I could get a little more bang for the buck in the region, the economy would recover and the promotion would be secured." She smiled pleadingly and held out her palms to him. "Once I got this job, we'd be on easy street. No worries about paying for college for the kids. No worries about retirement. No worries ever again." Frank could barely contain himself. "Was it all about money and your position in the company?" Meredith's hands rested on her lap again. "So John and I—" "John Collier?" said Frank grimly. "Yes," she continued, not catching his mood. "You've met him. Anyway, he and I figured out a way to move a few sales from our biggest accounts. We knew they'd show up eventually. We just booked them earlier in the current quarter. Every other region was reporting a significant decrease in sales, and we had a significant increase. The corporation was just thrilled. We earned the biggest bonuses the company has ever paid," she said proudly. Then the smile slid off her face like a cloth falling to the floor. "But the economy was getting worse, not better. And when John told me it would all come out eventually, I knew we had to do something about it. We needed a lot of money to pull this off. So John created a dummy vendor account and started sending fake invoices to IMC. They're so sloppy and wasteful over there, they didn't even notice." "So, you were planning to fake your pass away in a plane crash to cover your tracks?" asked Frank. "That's right, kid," she said, as if Frank was her star pupil. "With enough money, it's not hard to get someone to leave a Zodiac motorboat with a GPS signal in the Caribbean. We just homed in on the signal and landed right next to it." "So this whole thing was just a way to steal a lot of money and abandon the family?" asked Frank bitterly. "No, baby," she protested. "That's not it at all. I knew I'd have to get out of sight for a while, but I made sure you and the kids were okay. I took out life insurance and put everything I could into my 401k so you guys would have plenty of money," she said proudly. And you thought having enough money would make up for the loss of my wife and the mother of our children? This time she heard his bitterness. No, baby, no, you don't understand. I was going to come back for you. As soon as things settled down, I was going to contact you. We could go somewhere safe, baby. We could be together. As she spoke, her eyes continued to dart around the room. Frank looked at her with a stony stare. You're only missing one thing, he said in an even voice. What is it, baby? She asked. You forgot about having fun with John Collier, he said. She was scared at first, but then she stood up and held out her arms to him. No, baby, it wasn't like that. John and I just worked together. We were never more than co-workers. Don't lie to me, Meredith, Frank snapped back. Bobby saw you two together in our bedroom. She sighed. God, did Bobby see us? Oh, that's awful. A sob caught in her throat, but then she came to her senses and straightened up again. It was just one time, baby. He said he wouldn't help me unless I gave myself to him, but it was just one time. I swear. Frank stood up, ignoring her. He looked around. Come out, John, he said loudly. I know you're out here somewhere. Meredith continued to wail. No, baby, it's just me. It was just one time. But no sooner had she continued than John Collier appeared from the bedroom. He was wearing a robe and had his hands in his pockets. Lay off, Mary, he knows, Collier muttered, though he guessed they lived together. Hearing Collier use his wife's favorite name made Frank wince. Meredith began to cry. He must have found us through Facebook, Collier grumbled. I warned you, but you just had to check your two offspring. Then his tone changed to cold and hard. But that doesn't matter now. We need to get out of here. He turned to Frank and pulled an automatic rifle from his robe pocket, pointing it at Frank. As for you, bright boy, you're the only one who knows we're still alive. No, John, no, screamed Meredith, but Collier ignored her. Looks like your kids are going to lose not only their daddy, but their mommy too, he said with a chuckle, raising his weapon at Frank. I wouldn't do that if I were you, came a voice from the hallway. All three turned around in amazement and saw Celia Murray appear, holding a Smith & Wesson automatic at Collier's throat. Before Collier could react, a second voice came from behind him. Drop the weapon, Collier. It's over. Special Agent Harold Barnes emerged from the kitchen, his weapon also pointed at Collier. The former head of the accounting department looked at the two agents hostilely, but then his shoulders slumped. He dropped the weapon to the carpet and slowly raised his hands while Barnes held him at point. Celia quickly moved behind the sullen man, twisted one of his arms behind his back, and snapped handcuffs around his wrist. She then secured the other arm with the second handcuff. After restraining Collier, she did the same with Meredith. As the two lay on the floor, Barnes called the Palm Beach Police Department on his cell phone. A second call went to the local FBI office. Shortly after, the house was crowded with both uniformed and plainclothes police officers. Frank stood back, looking dumbfounded at what was happening. As the fugitives were led away, Frank scrutinized them both. Collier was muttering to himself, and Meredith was crying. Neither looked in Frank's direction. When they left, Celia walked over to Barnes, hugged him, and kissed him on the cheek. Thank you for coming with me, partner. I owe you a great debt of gratitude. The senior agent smiled. No, you don't owe me anything. Solving this case will reflect very well in our personal affairs. When Barnes left, Celia finally looked at Frank. To his amazement, she walked over to him, put her arms around his neck, and sobbed. You big idiot! Don't you ever do that to me again. You could have gotten yourself eliminated. He held her tightly until her crying subsided. Then he pulled her away enough to look into her face. What are you doing here? How did you know where to find me? She smiled through her tears. Lori called me to chat. When she told me you weren't with them at their grandparents' house, I suspected you were going to do something stupid and started making inquiries. When I saw her Facebook posts, I called the airline and found out you had booked a flight to Palm Beach. I talked Harold into coming with me, and we've been following you since early morning. She shook her head. We almost lost you when you took off after that cab, but Harold guessed which way you turned and was right. Frank pulled her even tighter against him. I guess you really are my guardian angel, he said and kissed her. 2 years later, Frank pulled the collar of his coat tighter around his neck. The humidity was high as always, and the wind off Puget Sound was cold and damp. Still, Frank thought, it feels good to be here. The last 2 years had been difficult in many ways. Discovering that his wife was alive was a terrible shock for Frank, but the consequences were even worse for Bobby and Lori. Her trial and conviction on numerous criminal charges only added to the family's pain. During the inevitable media frenzy surrounding the arrest and trial, Frank feared his children wouldn't make it through. The divorce was a mere formality. Legally, Meredith could no longer be dead, but she would spend the next 12 years of her life in Arundel State Prison. The International Marketing Corporation demanded that Frank return not only Meredith's life insurance policy, but also most of her 401k, since it was funded by unearned bonuses. As the innocent party, Frank may have had a reason to keep some of the funds, but he wanted nothing to do with any part of his ex-wife's money. Instead, he urgently looked for work as his family's savings were nearly depleted. The offer he received from a large aerospace company was coveted, not only because it would provide for his family, but also because it meant moving across the country. There were too many reminders of Meredith in Atlanta, and too many questions from friends and others that he and his children couldn't answer. Finding a new place to live and work seemed like the best solution for all of them. Frank didn't want to leave the state where he and his children were born, but he was ready to embrace the Pacific Northwest and start a new life. They were lucky enough to sell the house in Atlanta and buy a nice, albeit slightly smaller house in Seattle. Meredith had always wanted to live in a luxurious house, and Frank was happy with something cozier. The kids seemed to like it too, and they were already making friends at the new school. He walked in from the deck and looked around for his car keys. Finding them, he poked his head into the kitchen to look for his wife. "Come on, Angel, let's go get our kids." Celia smiled happily at him.